Okay, hi, my name is Katrina Matheson, and I am giving the guest lecture today for Justice for Children, Chapter 7 of the Tanner book. The lecture is called Border Crossing, Youth, Gangs, and Guns. So my background is that I am a PhD candidate in Science and Technology Studies, or STS, and my academic interest is in critical AI studies and science diplomacy. I'm American. I lived in LA for almost 40 years, and there I volunteered for a lot of organizations supporting vulnerable children. So obviously this course is, I'm a TA in this course, and it's of great interest to me. I also have a BA in STS from Stanford, and my hobby is actually organizing in Toronto around education funding. So I'm giving this lecture because I have a personal interest in LA gang history. I'm actually from LA, and I obviously am concerned with issues concerning human rights. And academically within my discipline, I have an interest in what's called dynamics of power, and how power is transferred, how power is sustained, and that's a core theme of STS. Okay, so just briefly, so you know where I'm coming from, STS, as I mentioned, it's a social study of science and technology. It's a pretty young discipline in the social sciences. And basically the main point of it is to challenge the idea that science is neutral, objective, infallible, universal, always positive, right? STS it's a critical perspective. It critically challenges aspects of science and technology. It started in the 1970s and 80s, kind of the landmark research that really established it as a discipline was called Laboratory Life by Bruno Latour and Stephen Woolgar, published in 1986. And their research showed, it was a study of a scientific lab, and it basically showed that laboratories have very strong dynamics of power that really affect results and findings and, how people conduct their research. So, again, showing that science is not, it's not like it's, some pure thing that is infallible. Okay, there's a lot here. I'm ambitiously wanting to tackle a lot. I really hope you bear with me. I have like 45 slides or something. I hope you will find it really interesting. I'm going to start with some of the definitions. I'm going to start with really the history, setting up the context of, what the Black gangs in LA kind of rose from. Yeah, and then just some it gets a little more theoretical, towards the end, but I really hope you will enjoy it. Okay, so first of all, talking about power, what is power? There's no inherent quality of power. There's nothing that you can look at and say, oh, that's something powerful. That's a powerful, inherently, like in and of themselves, like alone out of their context. You can't say that any one person or thing is powerful, right? Power is relational. Having power depends on your relationship to other people and things and the ability to make things happen, basically. Power starts with getting others to, excuse me, enroll is the term academically, to enroll, which is like to believe in or to accept in basically the paradigm of the network, whatever whatever you're pitching, basically. And that's called translation of power. When people buy into it, it's translation of power. And so when the network operates, when you have this like network of different social actors and also non-human actors as well, so technologies, things, those things all are together in a network. And basically, when the network works as it's expected, power is generated and maintained. So when networks operate effectively, power is being generated. And as I said, human and non-human actors together form a network, and I'll try to highlight that as we go through. Okay, what does it mean to live under hegemonic power? Okay, you might have heard that term, hegemonic or hegemony. Hegemonic power is a particular kind of power that was theorized by Gramsci. If you're talking just generally about hegemony, you might be just talking about dominant culture. But in a political context, hegemony, according to Gramsci, specifically, it's the use of cultural institutions to obtain consent from the masses for their own oppression, right? So you're getting people to enroll, you're getting people to agree to the paradigm that you're establishing, right? And it's consent versus coercion. Coercion would be like, being like Genghis Khan and like, forcing people into, submission or whatever. That's the opposite of consent, right? Those are the two kind of sides of hegemony. Either it's coercion or it's consent. And so Gramsci theorized about consent and the phenomenon of people actually agreeing to their own oppression. And consent, it means that we accept or even agree with the oppression because of what we've been told, what we know about the way things work, right? So there's this common sense to it, like, well, that's just how things are. That's just the way things work. And those are messages that are transmitted through cultural institutions, okay? Ideological power is invisible and it can't be resisted without consciousness. You have to be able to see and understand that there is oppression taking place, that you're being oppressed before you can resist, right? You have to know that it's happening. And in most cases, people are unaware that it's happening. How hegemons wield power, according to Gramsci. Gramsci is drawing from Marx as well. Okay, so basically Marx theorized, and Gramsci also, capital accumulation happens in favor of the elites. Okay, that's sort of like the first stage. So in that paradigm, non-elites experience what's called alienation, right? It's a lack of consciousness about one's own oppression. It's not really understanding your place. It's also maybe like losing your identity, kind of things that are unique to you, your people, etc. But it's really the hallmark is this lack of consciousness about your own oppression. And then also reification, right? Becoming objectified. So reification, yeah, it's becoming a thing, becoming an object. Humans, right, become reified into kind of labor, right? It becomes a thing that is like very dehumanized. And that reification can happen in a few different ways. And there's a few other examples I'll give. Cultural institutions refer to school, media, the fashion industry, really any cultural, social, body that might be responsible for, messaging, portraying what's cool, portraying, how people should think, etc. And in general, under this concept of hegemony, those cultural institutions disseminate ideas that support the elite's right to accumulate capital. At times, ideological threats to hegemony might arise, right, in the form of resistance. That's called counter-hegemony. And in response to counter-hegemony, the hegemon would reproduce and reify, that is, objectify or trivialize or take over elements of the resistance, and that renders it impotent. When the resistance gets taken up, like kind of symbols of the resistance get taken up by the hegemon, that is basically how they make it meaningless, right? How they take away the power from the resistance, right? Is when they trivialize it. I know this is a lot. Anyways, we'll be here a while. We'll go through it. Okay. So I'm going to start the socio-historical context of Black gangs in the United States. Okay, so I'm going to start with post-World War II. Okay, post-World War II, the U.S. was the global leader. They were this hero. I mean, maybe debatably, whatever. They were the hero coming out of World War II. And basically they architected a global economy post-World War II that really initiated, they call it the golden age of capitalism, right? There's, debates over how and why the US was able to do this, but in any event, the data is really clear. There was this basically straight line, up and to the right of growth. This is net capital formation, right? So basically this is just, capital accumulation, private industry, just going up and up and up and up and up. And it basically starts to falter in the early 70s. This is where they started to have an economic crisis. It was, there were a lot of things going on. Mostly it was the oil crisis, but Vietnam as well. anyway, it started to flag in the 70s, but they had a really, really incredible run of just total upward growth, straight line growth. And Black people benefited from at this time, right? Prior to World War II, there was also the New Deal, which put in a lot of social programs, right, to pull the U.S. out of the Depression. So there were a lot of positives, for working class people, for regular people, a lot of positive things happening through those programs in that period, and that did reach Black families as well, but not to the extent of white families. So Black wealth grew. I mean, basically up until the 50s, Black household wealth was basically zero, and it started to go positive basically in the 50s. And but there was still a really deep inequality, right, between Black families and white families. Well, okay. Also, in this time, the U.S. was still deeply racist, particularly in the South, the American South. Okay, so the programs that were implemented during the New Deal, right? A lot of them were implemented with rules that intentionally or not excluded Black families. The most famous example is redlining, right? The Black families couldn't get the loans to buy houses, right? Because they were trying to buy in Black areas, and Black areas were excluded, right? So there was this, even though they did have a benefit overall, they were really limited in terms of how much they could benefit because of this very systemic structural racism that they were experiencing. And then this led to, actually, even though the amounts of household wealth were going up, overall, the Black families held a declining share of wealth as a total percentage of US wealth, right? So the total family wealth was like going up like this, and they were going up like this, and their share was actually declining, right, during that time. And then also there was overt racism in the Deep South, just really horrific, horrific culture of, lynching and sundown towns, and, just really, really violent, super racist stuff. Apartheid level discrimination, when Black people tried to access schools and services and jobs. It was a very, very difficult time for, sorry, my dog, very difficult time for Black people. Okay, the 1960s, it was actually the late 50s. The late 50s brought the civil rights era. The movement for civil rights began in about 1954 in the American South. The catalyzing event was Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. And the leader who you probably heard of is Dr. Martin Luther King, who advocated for peaceful demonstrations, right? He was also a reverend, he was a man of the cloth. And so he really used this message of peace to find justice, right? And what was really, and here's my STS intervention, right? All of this, the civil rights era, all of this coincided with televisions in the home, right? You had televisions in the home, and that allowed people to see more of what was happening, in communities outside their own. People could suddenly, watch these events on the news, right? Which they had never been able to do really before in a widespread way. And that plays a role. We'll talk about it. Okay, so peaceful protests for Black rights. As I said, Dr. King advocated for peaceful demonstrations, but this was not. Now we regard him as a important, civil rights leader. There's a holiday in the U.S. for his birthday, et cetera. But at the time, he was not well liked by authorities. They hated him. And they smeared him. And they actively tried to sabotage him. At some point, so this was dated 1980, right? It was revealed that the CIA was spying on him. They actively wanted to discredit him as a Black leader. They saw him as a major threat, right? This peaceful pastor, right? They were absolutely just convinced he needed to go. And there's these documents got released basically, and there was a lot of dialogue about, they obviously didn't want to kill him directly, but they wanted someone else to. They talked about how, we need to get rid of him, but it can't, if we kill him, he'll be a martyr, and that'll make the movement stronger, right? So anyways, it was nasty stuff. And ultimately, again, there was an article in 2008. There were some FBI memos released. Actually, no, sorry. It was a letter that the FBI had sent to Dr. King. And basically it was meant to pretty overtly, trying to get him to commit suicide. Basically, they tracked him, they surveilled him extensively, and they found no association with communists. They found no, really nothing negative about the guy, except that he was having an affair. And so, with that, they were basically, they sent him this very nasty letter saying, King, you are done. There's only one thing left for you to do. Basically, people are assuming that means that they want him to kill himself. You know what it is. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. I mean, they were really going after him, right? It's kind of a psychological, attack on him. You're a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one at that. I mean, this is a man who was advocating peace, a leader in the community, right? So anyway, it was pretty unhinged what they were doing to him. And then obviously Dr. King was assassinated, not by the police, but who knows what scenarios may have been set up. Who knows? We don't know, right? Sorry, some of my photos are not right. This was a photo of Fred Hampton. Anyways, okay, I want to talk about the Black Panther Party, right? So the Black Panther Party, they're, kind of remembered as being a bit more militant than Dr. King. But one of the great leaders of the Black Panther Party was Fred Hampton. Fred started the Rainbow Coalition in Chicago, bringing together people of all races. This was very, very significant. Okay, Fred Hampton basically said here, this is a speech that he gave at Olivet Church in 1969. I'm not going to read all of it, but it's interesting, right? It's, basically he's like, look, black masses, brown masses, yellow masses too. Basically he's saying we got to come together, right? We don't fight racism with racism. We're going to fight racism with solidarity. We all have, we're all fighting the same fight, basically, against this capitalist exploitation, right? Let's see if I can, yeah, there's the photo of Fred. I'm sorry, it's not. That's Fred right there. And this was the Rainbow Coalition. So there's, different racial groups represented there in that meeting. Okay. Okay. So one of the legacies of Fred Hampton was that he started the Breakfast for Children program in Chicago. And this was exactly what it sounded like, feeding breakfast to kids. And it was, regarded as some kind of communist plot by the authorities. They arrested people for handing out food to children. And this part of, again, I'm not going to read it, but this comment that he makes, basically he's saying, when the police come around and they harass the parents and say, hey, this is communism. Don't you think this is communism and this isn't good? And basically the parents are like, the moms are like, what are you talking about? They're feeding my kid. Like, if it's communism, then I like it, So, I mean, the point that he's making is that the only way that you can win people to your cause is if you take care of them, right? If they can see the benefits that you're offering them, right? That's the translation of power, right? You've got to care for people. And then this was an interesting, just wanted to kind of put this out there, right? This is sort of towards the end of his speech. A couple things here. One, he says, Dr. King has a famous quote where he says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? And Fred kind of jumbles it a little bit, but he makes reference to that, right? And he says, He says, maybe some of you think, there's people that should be here that aren't here, and you think it's not going to be as good without them. Or maybe you think we need more people in our movement, or, maybe you think that like the pressure is too much from the authorities, but no. And he goes back to what King said. He says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? He's trying to reassure them that they're on the right path, right? Even if they get held up and whatnot. And, I reflect on this quote a lot, because it's like, is that true, right? You see a lot of backsliding happening. I mean, certainly in the States, my home country, there's a lot going on right now that's looking like we're slipping in a bad direction. And so, you have to kind of naturally question, does it really bend towards justice? Does it really? And me personally, the conclusion that I've come to, and this is me talking kind of as an organizer, right, is that it will bend if you make it bend. It doesn't automatically bend that way. It will bend if you make it bend. So we have to keep that in mind, right? We have to the democracy and like all these kind of positive things in society, like we have to take an active role in actually bringing those things about, because they don't just happen spontaneously. Okay, and then here in this last paragraph, he says, we've got Huey P. Newton in jail, Eldridge Cleaver underground, Bunchy Carter murdered, Bobby Hutton and John Higgins murdered, whatever. So he's listing basically all of the leaders of the movement who were basically killed or in jail or underground. And this is very sad. This is a very sad theme. This is not an exhaustive list. I mean, basically all of the strong Black leaders, the peaceful leaders, the leaders who were expressing real solidarity and resistance were all murdered during this era. So it left a real void, for the Black community in particular, in terms of the vision of what was possible. So that's, arguably it's genocidal. People have called it genocidal. But that is something that, is impactful, very impactful on the Black community. And then Fred Hampton himself, I'm sorry to report, Fred Hampton was also murdered by police in his apartment. They raided it illegally and killed him. So, that's unfortunate. Okay, I want to talk about the role of children in the civil rights movement. We've spent a lot of time in this class talking about how vulnerable children are, and they are vulnerable. But there's also a power that children have, and in particular, it was particularly notable. The power of children was particularly notable in the 1960s, in the civil rights era, and particularly that I would say children actually finally won civil rights for Black people in the US in 1965. This is something, this is actually a piece of history I didn't even know. I literally had never heard of this until just a couple of years ago. Actually, I think my first year teaching this class, I stumbled across it and I was like, what is this? I asked my husband, he'd never heard of it either. Like, also American, grew up in public school, yeah, I mean, I grew up in the 80s. My husband's a little bit older than me. And like, it's just very interesting that they choose not to highlight this story about the power of children, to kids growing up. I think that's, potentially an intentional choice to omit that from the textbooks. But basically, so something happened in 1963 called the Children's Crusade in Birmingham. This was a headline I took, right? There's probably a link attached here. Most of them I've tried to put links. Yeah. So it links to a history.com article about it. But anyway, yeah. So basically, facing a dwindling movement in Alabama, civil rights leaders recruited Black students to revive the March to End Segregation. So what happened was Dr. King was in Alabama at this time and trying to build his movement, trying to enroll, people into this fight, this protest, peaceful protest. And ultimately, it wasn't really going well because it was very difficult for people to continue to protest because ultimately they would get arrested. These were Black people who were already, maybe in precarious economic situations. They couldn't afford to be in jail. They couldn't afford to not go to work. They couldn't afford to be away from their family. And so, the idea of the peaceful protests, it was losing steam because, it just wasn't working fast enough. It just wasn't gaining enough attention. And so Dr. King apparently did not want to use children. He did not want children to necessarily be involved, but it got to a point where basically the adults just weren't coming out. And I don't remember who had the idea, but someone was like, no, like we need to use the kids. And so basically they orchestrated this walkout, a student walkout. It was May 2nd and 3rd, I think, 1963. They organized it through the churches, right? They organized it through the churches, and there was a lot of preaching done at the churches. And they said they had a code, and the code was there's a party at the park and bring your toothbrush. And the party at the park meant we're all going to meet, at the, we're all going to be protesting at the park, and bring your toothbrush meant you're going to go to jail, right? So bring your toothbrush. And, these are kids, elementary kids through, older kids as well. And as you can see, look, this was a very religious, peaceful movement. These kids, they're church kids, recruited for peaceful protests. So what was really remarkable about their tactics was that they, I something like 1,500 kids or something like that. I mean, they had quite a number of kids, and they came from all over, right? But what they did was they had them all meet at a church, and they sent the kids out in groups of 50. And this was critical because the police would come, they would deal with the 50 kids, they would pull them away in the police wagon, and then they would send out another 50, right? And they kept doing this, and they could not handle the continuous flow, right? They could not handle the continuous flow. And so it became overwhelming for the police. So here they are marching. I mean, you can see, look, these look like, maybe fifth graders. Yes. Okay, it led to the arrest of nearly 800. The teachers and students sang hymns and peace, right? So the first day was peaceful, right? And they're getting arrested, but it's peaceful. And the second day, it was like we can't handle this, right? The police were obviously stretched thin and stressed about this. And so they brought out high pressure water hoses, snarling dogs, wooden clubs. Okay. So these were the photos that got disseminated again on TV and also in mainstream news media like magazines and newspapers. And it was horrific. It was horrific. These are children literally being attacked by dogs, obviously being peaceful. This galvanized the public. Suddenly they're seeing, the public is seeing this for the first time. Not everyone lives in the South, right? They're seeing this for the first time. And look, there was a lot of pressure all of a sudden. It was like, what are you guys doing down there? Like, what is this? It's so violent. It's, these kids are just kids. Like, you can't do this. And so it really, this singularly, the Children's Crusade changed the entire civil rights conversation. I think it really earned it. It really earned that civil rights legislation, right? Which is important. It's really important. Because that was real resistance, right? That was real resistance. It was genuinely earned. Okay, so by the late 1970s, civil rights legislation had been won by the Black community. It was 1965 was the Civil Rights Act. But all of the inspiring Black leaders were dead. Black communities were still impoverished, right? They still never caught up to the white families. They were still being oppressed by systemic racism and discrimination. And look, as I said, the 70s, that was when the economic downturn started. The empire was flagging. It was flagging socially on multiple fronts. They'd had an embarrassing defeat in Vietnam at home and abroad, right? Because part of it was about their military strength, but also part of it was the fact that, in parallel to the civil rights era, you also had the student demonstrations against Vietnam. And that also got out of hand. The state also responded with incredible violence. You had the Kent State Massacre where National Guard murdered, I think it was 4 college students, white college students. So you really had the empire like struggling to keep itself together and still maintain that kind of like facade of like, doing the right thing. You also had Nixon's resignation, which was a really significant event in US history. And then again, economically, you had the 2 oil crises, one in early 70s, one was later in the 70s. But, these were all very, very stressful things, a stressful environment for, the empire. I call it the empire, for the American government to maintain power, right? Power over the people. Then we have Reagan coming in, right? 1981, Reagan was inaugurated. So Reagan didn't consider himself racist. And I think this is significant because I think that's probably true. I think he probably didn't consider himself racist, but he held clearly very deeply racist views he didn't even realize were racist. I don't know what year this was, but at some point there was audio after Reagan's death. Some audio came out of him having a conversation with Nixon, and basically saying super racist things about these representatives from African countries at the UN. Right? He called them monkeys, and horrifically racist. Right? And I think that basically his daughter, after that leaked, his daughter came out and said, look, my dad wasn't a racist. He, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, she recognized that the tapes were appalling. And I think that was really the brand of mainstream American racism was like, I'm not overtly racist. I'm not going to go lynch anyone. But at the same time, I'm going to make jokes and I'm going to like disregard, Black people, basically. Okay, so the 80s, one of the scandals of the 80s was the Iran-Contra cocaine scandal. If you haven't heard of this is pretty incredible. Just brace yourself. But basically, the Contras were a guerrilla resistance group. Basically in 1979 in Nicaragua. Okay, Nicaragua, 1979. Nicaragua had been through a lot. There was a lot, a lot horrible, extreme poverty in Nicaragua. 1979, the Sandinistas were elected. It was a socialist government that was democratically elected. And basically, the US government saw the Sandinistas as a threat to US corporate interests. There had been, a lot of socialist activity coming out of Latin America and a lot of counter efforts by the US, mostly very successful, of basically overthrowing those socialist governments and installing essentially dictators that would be good partners to the US, right? And the things that they were fighting against were like, nationalizing resources and stuff like that. That was what the socialists in general wanted to do. And that was a major, major threat to US corporate interests who had become very accustomed to, drawing national resources from those countries and then, drawing the raw materials and then, making huge profit off of those resources. Anyway, the Contras were anti-Sandinistas, and the first Iran-Contra scandal was regarding weapons sales, right? There was this Army, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who apparently allegedly diverted funds from Iranian weapons sales to fund the Contras, right? So that was the first, I remember those hearings. I was like a little kid. That was a big deal. But then in 1996, another story broke, right? This other story broke that the US government actually was, it's incredible to say, had either facilitated or otherwise turned a blind eye to hard drugs, cocaine, and particularly crack cocaine, which is a very like potent form of cocaine, flooding into Black communities, right? And there's, it's suggestive that they were actively like putting the drugs there themselves, right? Um, Flooding the Black communities, right, with these drugs. The government, the U.S. government. The CIA, as far as I understand, still denies this, right? But at the time, in '96 when this all broke, multiple, seasoned journalists, newspaper outlets came to the conclusion that there's no way that the government didn't know that this was happening or was somehow involved. So basically they were, sorry, I missed a point there. They were running these drugs into the communities, and then the sale of those drugs basically was funneling back to the Contras, right? So they were using the drug sales to then fund, these anti-Sandinista, anti-socialist guerrillas, right? So that was the triangle. So there's a, this was investigated or whatever. Here's kind of this, if you click on the link there, there's a summary of like kind of all of the twists and turns of this crazy thing. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the government effectively was destroying Black communities with massive amounts of drugs that they were, obviously using to fund other imperialist, exercises elsewhere in Latin America. Okay. I found this interview with this former Crip gang member named Tyrone White. I cut it down. It was like a 30-minute interview. I cut it down to like 12 minutes. So I want to go through this and I want you to hear it from him, like what his story was. But I'm going to stop it periodically, and I just want to like interject some commentary. See if this works.
Decades, the Republican
Oops,
Party has
that's
championed
not it.
the unborn. And while the 20
Sorry, there we
my
go.
name is Tyrone White. I'm a former 6'5" member of Crip. Some of my rivalries were blood gangs and the Crip gangs. We were involved in drive-by shootings as well as drug dealing. And this is how crime works. From the early 80s all the way up through the mid 90s, those were the years of heightened gang activities. So drive-by shootings were nothing. You could literally turn your news on every day during those years and see a drive-by shooting. I mean, every day. The word crip really originally meant community resistance and progress. It was a way to bring the community, to uplift the community, to protect the community.
Okay. So first of all, he talked about how violent it was in the 90s. I definitely, even though I was like pretty far from where the main crux of the violence was, um, it was very, very prevalent in sort of the ethos of LA was like, oh, drive-bys. Like it was literally constant violence that we would hear about. And uh yeah, it was extreme. Like I can't even explain how extreme it was. Even for me growing up in the valley, very far from it, it was like very much in the consciousness. And then the second thing he said was, it's really important, is that the gangs started as community resistance, right? Crip community resistance. There's some controversy over like what the acronym actually was, but basically they were trying to protect themselves against the police, the corrupt police that would come in and just, pick people off or, whatever. And that was how the first gangs, the Crip gangs, that was how they started, was actually being a resistance movement against the violence that they were experiencing at the hands of the police.
course, they took on a moniker and the appearance of a gang because according to the dictionary, a group of five or more people is considered a gang.
Okay, group of five or more people considered a gang. So he's speaking there to the very subjective nature of like what defines a gang, right? So, you know, in this course, we talked about childhood as a social construction, right? Now we're talking about gangs. Gangs as a social construction. That is a really critical point that you know, the police just define a gang as a group of five or more hanging out together, right? That's a gang. And of course you can have kids who are not criminals hanging out, right? Of course. But because they're in the Black community, because there's this, you know, baked in tension with the police, you know, because there's, you know, frankly, you know, this sort of like genocidal push to, you know, harm these Black communities, right? Like you know, these young Black kids or young Black men were being labeled as gang members. And when that initially started, that was not necessarily their intention, was to, you know, was to be that way, but they became criminalized, right? That label was put upon them, right, of gang, right? And and then they, you know, there's sort of an interplay, right, between those two things. But, you know, initially the point of the gang, the point of the Crips was to serve as community resistance.
Crips were founded in the 60s and by Raymond Washington. He formed the East Side Crips, which is on the east side of LA. Tiki Williams formed the West Side Crips. And through those two different foundations, different sets start to evolve. Different areas, you know, the Hoovers, the East Coast, the Rolling 60s, the Menlos, all these different sets. The object and the goal was to keep this side of LA safe. But, you know, as usual, things escalated, things multiplied, and violence began to happen. When Raymond Washington got killed, that's what caused the division.
Okay. When Raymond Washington got killed, that's what caused the division. I don't even know who Raymond Washington is, but I want to raise the point here that when when these incidents happen that escalate the violence dramatically, that's very common, right? In these gang, you know, like there's always this back and forth of like, you know, revenge and whatnot. And then, you know, something really bad happens and then it just sort of like sets off an explosion. You know, that's a very common thing to happen, right? In these gang relations. And what I want to point out is, and this happened in the 60s as well, very often the police infiltrate these organizations. Black Panthers were infiltrated, and they'll be infiltrated by people, by cops, basically, or maybe non-cops, I don't know, but agents of law enforcement who will then incite violence. They will try to like encourage this, you know, something to set off much more violent things, right? And often they're, you know, successful. I don't know for sure, you know, if that's what happened in that particular case he's referencing, but it is a very like part of their playbook. It's a very well-worn part of their playbook to actually entrap and to actually, you know, make ultra violent things happen that would not have happened had they not been there agitating, you know, from the inside, right? As basically, you know, spies or like, or whatever. But it's such a fragile ecosystem, like the gang ecosystem. And then to have someone coming in basically trying to cause problems, trying to get people to be more violent than they would have normally been. Also, you know, very, very damaging, very sinister.
That's when cripping became divided between the East and the West, and different things start happening in different subsets. And it just became like a disease. You can even buy guns from enemy gangs. Because right now it's a business, it's about making this money. They come from everywhere. Now, where they get them from could be from the police force, it could be from the military. You can never be caught when we caught them.
Okay. I'm not gonna zoom into this one, but yeah, basically he mentioned, he kind of alludes to the fact that in the case of guns, a lot of it is coming from the police, the military, right? How, you know, how do you think they get weapons? There actually, there was a case, maybe like 10 years ago, I want to say, there was a case where there was this DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, I forget what it's called. Like they had this plot to they wanted to try and like track, they had this idea to catch the not drug runners, the gun runners, um, by putting guns in the hands of like Mexican gangs, which are extraordinarily violent, right? And to like basically sell them guns and then see what happens to the guns. Okay, well, they lost track of the guns. And then suddenly, like, there's all these US military grade weapons in Mexico, and Mexico's like, what the hell? Like, why did you do that? Right? Like, this is like, this is the way that US law enforcement has been operating. It's not, it's very questionable, very questionable.
Or lacking or slipping. You got to always be ready. You got to have enough firepower. You are ready for war at all times. I was born and raised in South Central LA all my life. I had a stepfather in my life that taught me how to be a man and different things. But for the most part, I was raised by a strong single mother. Usually in the black neighborhoods, when kids that come from single parent homes like that, they usually get caught up in these streets because your mom is out working, trying to make a living for you, provide for you. While she's at work, you're out there running the streets doing it.
Okay, I'm sure you guys could, foresee this point coming, but yeah, basically the kids who don't have the supervision because their parents have to work, single parent families, mom works multiple jobs, whatever, not home in the evening. All of these things contribute to the fact that the kids are lacking support, they're lacking resources, they're lacking things to do, they're lacking opportunity. And that is a large part of why gangs proliferate, is because there's not enough resources in the community, and or the parents, the families are being exploited, economically.
That you're not supposed to be doing. The gang structure is not so much organized like the mafia with underbosses and bosses and stuff like that. We didn't get titles like that. But people automatically knew who the OGs were, who the double OGs were, who the big homies was, and who was ranked over who. The double OG is usually one of the big homies that has put in more work than you can imagine. He's done it all. Killed, robbed, made money, been to jail, everything you name it, he's done it. Usually 50s, 60s, higher age that they were around in the 70s and the 80s when gangbangers really just exploded. They were at the top of their game. An OG really falls, not too much different from a double OG, except that he may be a little younger, may have done a little less of the crimes. Street soldier is exactly what that sounds like. A street soldier is gonna go out there and put in that work for the OG, for the double OG, for the little homies, or just for the set, period. A street soldier has no limits. He's gonna go out there and do what he has to do, no matter what.
Big red flag. The street soldier has to do what he's got to do. Okay, I mean, this language, I mean, he's describing like child soldiering, right? Which is recognized internationally as a human rights violation. And it just casually is happening, in cities across America, right? I mean, they're children. They're children. And they're not treated like children, right? They're treated like criminals when in fact they are being exploited. The other thing I wanted to comment about his description of the hierarchy is that when you have this, intricate hierarchy, kind of perpetual hierarchy, what that signals is that you can never eradicate gangs with law enforcement, because law enforcement's never going to get to every level, right? They might take out people at the middle, the bottom, the top, like once in a while, right? They might get to certain groups, but they're never going to take down the whole thing, right? So law enforcement as a strategy for gang, suppression it's doomed. Like, it's doomed to fail. It's not like there's no way that they can actually eradicate gang violence just from law enforcement. It's not possible.
The little homies are usually, of course, what they sound like. The little homies that's living up to the big homies. They're going to imitate, they're going to copy everything that the big homies do. And if the big homies is constantly going to jail, robbing people, shooting people, killing people, the little homies going to follow suit at some point. I started out selling weed in middle school and then moved to crack cocaine and robbery. I did robberies. That was my way mostly of making money and keeping money in my pocket. The big homies had the big dope and they'll issue it out to the younger homies. They'll issue it down to the guys to the next level. And it was a way for everybody from the big homie, OG homies, all the way down to the homies in junior high school, Jamaica.
Okay, so he's saying that it wasn't among, hold on, I'm gonna stop sharing him. The economic activities that the gangs participated in, right? These high value drug sales, weapon sales, whatever it was. The wealth did not concentrate at the top. It was dispersed throughout. They had a system of taking care of the whole, the whole chain of command. Everyone was taken care of. That goes back to, the translation of power concept, right? What Fred Hampton said, to win people over, to enroll them in your paradigm, you need to show them care, right? You need to show them care. That's how you gain, that's how you earn power. That's how you win power, right?
Money. The homies in junior high school, they may be out there selling crack on the corners, $5 rocks, $10 rocks, $20 rocks. The big homies, they move in big weight, the ounces, quarter pounds, stuff like that. The drugs came from a lot of times from drug cartels and as well as the government, believe it or not. I mean, there's a story about Freeway Rick, one of the biggest black dope dealers in history of Los Angeles. And he was caught up in that Iran-Contra stuff with Ronald Reagan, and come to find out that the DEA was supplying him with dope, the same dope that they gave him 30 years for in prison. So, it's like, that's just how it works. They put it in our neighborhoods to bring us down, to keep us down. Always a goal of Crips, to make a substantial amount of money.
So he kind of alludes, he alludes there to the thing I mentioned about the Iran-Contra scandal, but he makes it sound like a conspiracy. And I just want to speak to that for a second, because it's not a conspiracy to the extent that like everyone is aware of what's happening. Everyone has this sort of grand, plan for, to oppress Black people. It's not like that, right? Because what people are enrolled in is this paradigm that is the oppression is simply baked into the paradigm. So it's not necessarily a conscious conspiracy where people are like, oh, we're going to do this. Okay, we're going to do that. It's not like that. It's just the nature, the relationships, like how the power is oriented, right? Who is just naturally at the bottom, right? Like things, what you can get away with. It's like, these are unspoken things. So it's less a conspiracy as much as it is just a paradigm of oppression.
And to open up your own business, whether it be a smoke shop or liquor store or a food place or whatever. That was the goal, to find a way to take that money and make it somewhat as legal as you can.
Okay. So he's describing the desire of the gang members basically to use their resources to then funnel that into something somewhat legal, right? A smoke shop or a restaurant or something like that. Okay, this is an example of false consciousness, right? This idea that this sense of like, oh, empowerment, but it's not really empowerment, right? Because you're still in the same paradigm. It's not really empowerment if you are being enrolled then in the sort of capitalist system, right? You're not striking out against it, right? You are trying to get into it, right? That's what Marx would call the false consciousness, right? Because you don't have awareness. Even if you get to that point of where you feel empowered, you still don't have the awareness of what your position is. You're not actually resisting anything. You're actually just you're trying to enroll yourself in it, basically.
The LA riots happened in '92. I was 18 years old at that time. The LA riots was a result of the Rodney King verdict. Those 4 officers that were clearly guilty as hell on video beating Rodney King half to death when they were found innocent.
Okay, did you see that video, that flash? I don't know if you guys have seen that image before. No.
The LA riots was a result of the Rodney King verdict. Those 4 officers that were clearly guilty as hell on video beating Rodney King half to death.
Okay, so this video was like iconic video of the 90s that kicked off. Again, it's technology, right? Like the TV in the civil rights era, here we have the video camera, right? The like massive video camera. Someone was filming this traffic stop and Rodney King just absolutely getting beat up. And this basically clearly clearly being beaten by officers, not really resisting. He did try to get up, right? But not clearly resisting in any kind of like violent sense or anything like that. And the officers went on trial and they got acquitted. They got acquitted. They were found totally not guilty of anything, right? And so this was I mean, this like kicked off like a firestorm, right? The riots were intense. Again, I was in the Valley and I remember that day I was in eighth grade and it was like, we had kids bus to our school. LA has like this complicated, desegregation busing system, right? We had kids bused to our school from those communities and it was like they can't go home. I remember it was just a really dramatic day. You could see fires. Like, it was craziness. It was absolutely crazy.
When they were found innocent, that just sparked something in the community. I didn't never think I would see nothing like that. The ground zero of the riots happened 5 blocks from my house. I'm sitting at home watching the news. I see the news. So we jump in the car, we drive up to the riots. By this time, you got hundreds and hundreds of people starting to migrate to Florence and Norman. So at this point, it just kicked off. Every was literally like wildfire. Every car that came through the intersection that had a white person in it was getting attacked. I saw news reporters getting beat up. I saw cameramen getting beat up, getting the cameras taken from them. And at that time, it really didn't matter what gang you were from because now it's a black against white thing now. So it didn't matter if you was a blood or a crip or whatever you was, even though it was such a messed up day, such a messed up day, it was also a day to kind of rejoice because that was the first time in a long time that you saw common enemies, Crips and Bloods and Mexican gangs come together against this one common enemy, the LAPD.
So this is like really significant what he's describing, right? Because this, all of these choices, all of these, like if we're thinking about the gang landscape as a network, right? You've got the insertion of the drugs, you've got insertion of the guns, you've got insertion of the like dirty cops, like you've got all of these different, factors and players like in this network, right? All exerting these different forces on each other. And all of those things were creating or causing or contributing to these divisions among the Black communities. The Black communities and other racialized communities, they were all deeply divided over these like I don't want to say stupid, but like, sometimes very minor, issues, right? Or issues of commerce, in terms of like territory, drug territory and whatever. But like all of these things were actively keeping them divided. And then this verdict happened, and it was something that people could see so clearly, the white LAPD cops being criminal, and then they got acquitted, and then suddenly they were like, wait a minute, you guys aren't the enemy. It's the dirty cops that are the enemy. That's the enemy. And it refocused everyone. I mean, this was like a very significant thing that happened organically.
And so after the days of rioting, some of the community leaders like Jim Brown, the football player, a couple of popular gang leaders from different gangs, from different areas, different sets, had a meeting and decided that this was the perfect opportunity to try to bring a peace treaty, a truce between the gangs. Even though it was something bad that caused us to get to that level, it still was an opportunity for us to bring things together. Peace treaty lasted officially.
Okay. I want to talk about the peace treaty. So, to be honest with you, I take a little bit of issue with how like the gangs and gang violence and stuff is portrayed in the textbook. Like I don't, because to me, what is really the significant story about the gang violence is that when they did have this truce was like really important, because what happened was so like growing up, I heard all about gang prevention. I mean, the LAPD was like so focused on gang prevention, like everything, gang prevention, the gang unit, whatever. It was so focused on gang prevention. And then ultimately, you know, in the aftermath of the riots, the gang leaders themselves said, hey, we need to like refocus our efforts here. We need to come together. And they themselves initiated a truce, right? It came from them, from within the community, right? Because they said, we are stronger together fighting against these clearly oppressive forces, of the state, apparatus of the state, we're stronger together, right? I think that message also gets really lost when, we talk about what to do about gangs. It's like, it's that consciousness that clarity and that consciousness they suddenly had as a result of the guilty verdict, triggered that like real consciousness, not the false consciousness of like, oh, we're fighting over, drug territory. No, real consciousness about, um, who the enemy actually is, right?
Maybe a good couple weeks, and it kind of continued to dissolve as weeks and months went on, and to the point to where it didn't exist.
Okay, he kind of poo-poos the long-term effects of the truce, but that, first of all, that wasn't my recollection, because I remember, I mean, again, with a grain of salt, because I wasn't in it, but my recollection was that things never got as bad as they were in the early 90s, like in 1991, when you were hearing about horrible gang murders every day, every day, every day. It never got as bad as it was. So yeah, things fell apart. They did go back to their, the rifts that they had, but it definitely dampened the violence. Like there's no question. And I did find other academic. Oh, by the way, I want to say this is not well researched, right? I found like a couple of articles. I found a couple of like master's theses, on this topic of like, the truce, the the gang dynamics and stuff like that with the LAPD. I mean, there were a few articles. It's very under researched, right? And this is also why we need people from marginalized communities to actually become academics, because we need this kind of research. We need people to look at these things with a different lens, a critical lens, and to really help us understand, like what works, right? What works in society? What should we be striving for? So anyway, I just wanted to say, yeah, I did find research that did suggest that the effects of the truce was considered a success, even though it didn't hold, as a ceasefire. It did definitely dampen the violence at that time.
Gangsta rap came out, it introduced a lot of Crips. And when NWA came out, which is the group that started gangsta rap, Eazy-E, rest in peace. Eazy-E was known to be a Crip, and from him you had other pioneer rappers that were from Crip neighborhoods. You had Snoop Dogg, you had Dub C, all these popular gang rappers that was in the neighborhoods representing their hoods that were blowing up on the mainstream. And so now you got people sitting at home watching MTV, 106 and Park. They're watching all these video shows, and they got these gang members with doing rap videos with the blue rags and the six foes and the low riders and wearing all the gang attire and the gang uniform, but they're actually artists making money on TV. And now it's being broadcast all over the world, aside from the UK and nothing.
Okay, I'm going to talk about this in a couple slides from now, but this commodification, is another tactic to just render meaningless, right? Any real resistance, right? Is commodification.
Netherlands, I heard about Crips in China. I heard there's some Crips in Africa, which I've actually seen online, social media. People in Africa cripping and just loving this West Coast culture. And I think all these countries adapted onto these United States values and these United States ways just because of how it was glorified.
I love that he calls it United States values. I love that. It's so true. It's so true. I mean, because clearly this culture was created by United States values, right? This oppression of Black people. I mean, not the values that we purport to have, that we pretend to have, right? But the oppression of Black people, the, exploitation, commodification, all of these really, ugly things, that is what we're exporting. That is what we're exporting. I love that he said that.
Not really understanding the meaning of it. That people lost their lives and people are killing. This is not something to play with. In 1994, I went to Oklahoma. I got a football scholarship to go to Oklahoma to play football. That's pretty much really what saved me from being killed or anything else bad happening to me on these LA streets. Played football there for 2 years at a historically black college in 1996, 97. I moved to Oklahoma City, and I started working at the juvenile detention center. They needed a gang advisor, a gang trainer. So of course I was qualified for that, just volunteering my time, talking to the kids and, educating them on gangs and telling them, because I had no idea Oklahoma had a gang problem. So I went and I sat down with the chief of police to see exactly, where did he want me to go with this. I did 2 years in the school system. They came to me and asked me that I want to interested into transferring to the streets, basically running traffic, pulling people over, writing tickets, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, let me do that. I'll do that. See what that's like. I actually want to see how they dealt with drug dealers, being on the other side of it. And all the complaints that I had as a criminal, all the police brutality, all of the treatment from the police, I got to witness that firsthand working with them. And a lot of times I would have to intervene on hold on, it was a couple of times where they have to have a conversation with me. Look, either you with us or you with them. My experience with the LAPD.
Either you're with us or you're with them, right? So what he's describing is that he was observing effectively criminal behavior, right? Criminal behavior by the cops that he was working with. And he would call them out and they would say, either you're with us or you're with them. Okay. So when we're talking about gangs, okay, the kind of, the most basic definition is like a group of 5 or more, right? Hanging out, right? You might put a little bit of an edge on it and say, oh, it's them, someone, a group of 5 like committing crimes, right? Well, I don't know. Suddenly it's like the definition of the law enforcement it's looking a lot like a gang. I forgot to put it in my slides, but actually another interesting LA bit of, trivia is that the LA sheriffs, which is different from the LAPD, right? The sheriffs operate in the unincorporated areas of LA, like certain cities, basically cities that either aren't part of LA or are like unincorporated, have the sheriff department, or if they're their own city, but then they don't have enough money to have their own police force, so they have the sheriffs. They contract the sheriffs to patrol in their areas, right? And the sheriffs, if you Google like LASD, LA Sheriff Department, gangs, okay, it was revealed that this is so crazy, not only is the sheriff department, they have they're literal gang members. Like they literally have matching tattoos. They get tattoos for when they kill people, as cops, right? Not only is this totally rampant in the LA Sheriff's Department, I don't even know if he's the chief of police now, but Michael Moore. Sorry, it's been a long time since I've been in LA. Chief Moore. I forget what his first name is. Chief Moore came from the sheriff's department and he has these freaking tattoos. Like the chief of LAPD, the chief of police came from the sheriff's department and was basically a gang member in the sheriff's department. So, I think, abstractly you can make the argument oh, are the police a gang or whatever? They there's the history of police is they were slave patrol, right? That's the history of police in the South. You can kind of make that as an abstract argument, but no, in LA, you can literally make the case. They are literally a gang. They literally have initiation. They literally have, visible tattoos. It's not subtle. It is not subtle.
They still haven't found a way to deal with communities and cultures that they don't know nothing about. It's the same tactics, dirty cops, bogus charges, planting drugs, mistreatment because of who you are or what you represent. It's the same thing. It hasn't stopped. That's why even after I became a police officer and I moved back to California, I still ended up hooking back up with my old homies and old gang members, and I ended up going to jail. Even after being a police officer, I went to jail. You think?
Yeah, I just want to say, it's clearly so embedded in the culture, right? And because so much of the criminalization is a result of the dynamic, simply the dynamic of the gang and the police just operating in the same space. yeah, I mean, he came back into that environment. He got caught up in it again because that is simply the embedded culture, um, which, makes when you're trying to, stem this violence and reduce the amount of criminal activity and criminalization, like this is a significant aspect, right? It's very hard to escape, the culturally escape this dynamic.
Thing that made me change my life was my kids. When I took the scholarship to the school, I was in the process of changing my life. I just didn't know it. But that was my start of changing my life. And when I started working with gangs and talking to the kids in the schools and at the juvenile jails, and I seen how I was getting through to them and how much they respected me from what I was telling them and trying to teach them, it just made me want to change. It just made me want to continue to do positive things. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I met somebody one day, they told me I had this look. It's like, you should get into acting, you should think about acting. So I started doing acting little gigs, doing extra roles. And so I've done several projects and been a part of several TV series and dramas and different things that have gotten my foot into the door of acting. So there's definitely some positivity that could happen from my past that was negative.
So it's a bit tragic, right? I find it a bit tragic because, he's very, seems like a bright guy. I mean, he, should have all the opportunity in the world, right? But he's limited to acting, which I'm not saying acting is bad, right? But unfortunately, and I worked, my job prior to coming back to school was I worked in film and TV. Unfortunately, the media industry is, I don't know if I should call it racist, or it is committed to selling what sells. And unfortunately, what sells is very stereotyped. It's a very tragic sort of career path, I think. Tragic in a, not in a, maybe not in a, in the way you normally use the word tragic, like no one's going to die, but it's tragic because it's like, he's getting these acting roles. And I have friends, personal, like close friends who are in a similar situation where they're pursuing acting and they're getting roles and they get cast as the thug and the gang member. And, there's just not a lot for them in terms of actually showcasing, their skills, having a leading role. It's a, I mean, it's a really disappointing feature of the industry. And so anyway, it's just, I'm glad that he's, it's giving him an opportunity, whatever, to do acting, but it's a sad path, I think, as well. It's a sad path. And, once you get older, it's like, the roles get even more limited, right? When you have a certain look like that. My analysis of his interview. Okay, so we saw lack of parental supervision, right? The single mother's economic hardship, it pushed him to the streets. The drug running in the community with the US government issued cocaine, right? Enrolls those Black boys and men of all ages into this dark economy, this illegal economy, making them feel empowered, right? But that's a false consciousness, and distracting them from pursuing real counter-hegemonic activity, real acts of resistance, which is, as Fred Hampton was describing, that care, right? The care in the community. What the gangs were originally founded to do was to provide care. And and getting them all wrapped up in the drugs, it distracts them from that. The drug trade, additionally, it keeps the different Black communities from having unity with each other. And those tense dynamics make it easy for the law enforcement to infiltrate and entrap them, right? Again, they come in when tensions are high, someone comes in and they're like, we need to go in and we need to like be violent and we need to do this and that. And that may work or it may not work, but oftentimes those are plants. They're plants from law enforcement trying to agitate, to escalate violence, so that those people can be more effectively criminalized, basically. So Enrollment into the gang economy criminalizes and dehumanizes Black men. You know, he described being ready for war at all times, right? It's very dehumanizing. But it creates just enough wealth and opportunity to allow Black dehumanization to reproduce in popular culture, right? The glorification through music and film. It's able to, like with, you know, NWA, it's able to kind of get out there a little bit, and then that exports this basically culture of dehumanization to really racialized cultures elsewhere, which, you know, serves the interests of like the global empire. There's an intricate and perpetual gang hierarchy, and that means that law enforcement alone is never going to eradicate gangs. We'll talk about what is needed. Even if you leave the hood and pursue legal avenues, you still can't escape that culture, right? That dynamic, because of the dynamic of being oppressed. You can't, you know, no education. It's not necessarily going to fix the dynamics, right? That's what needs to be fixed. Tyrone moved from a street gang to being a police officer, aka also a gang, right? Questionably, right? And the LA riots sparked a temporary peace rooted in solidarity among rival factions. It didn't totally hold, though. It didn't totally hold. Okay, so moving on to the controversy, right? How do you solve gang violence? So option one was really what they pursued in that Watts truce, right? The truce that came out of the riots. So this was like a strategy. Treat them like warring political factions. Treat it like how you would treat the Northern Ireland, you know, fight with UK, how you would treat like the West Bank, you know, the Arab-Israeli relations, that they were literally using that, you know, those things as models, right? I included this quote by coincidence. My cousin was the former DA of Los Angeles. He was the DA, district attorney during the riots. Really interesting guy. My favorite story about him, Robert Philbosian, is that when he was working as a prosecutor, some evidence got revealed during a case that he was presiding over, or he was prosecuting, evidence that he wasn't aware of, he didn't know. And basically, when they got to closing arguments, he basically told the jury, he was like, don't convict, because clearly he didn't, you know, he basically felt like the evidence was exonerating. And so he literally told the jury not to convict, and they didn't. And he got scolded by the judge, and he was like, look, I can't, in good conscience, I can't convict him, you know, if I think that he was exonerated by this evidence. So anyway, I think he was a good guy. There are lots of interesting stories about him. He died just a few months ago. He was my grandma's first cousin. But anyway, he was the DA of LA, and this was from an article by someone named Seneca Vaught. So they quoted Robert Philbosian, and drawing the connection to images of the West Bank, right? I'll just read this really quickly. This shows how bad it was. Rival gang activities have turned areas of the county into war zones. Each attack is viewed by the victim's gang as a cause for new revenge. Reason is lost. A lethal act may be payment in advance or collection of past debts. Additionally, gang violence creates a climate of terror for the citizens who live in the affected areas. Family-owned residences are frequently riddled with gunshots. Some of these families eat and sleep on the floor at night for fear of getting shot. Residents do not venture outdoors after dark because they know from experience that a substantial number of the victims of gang violence are innocent bystanders. The stray bullet phenomenon. In certain neighborhoods in LA, the sound of gunfire is so commonplace that law-abiding citizens no longer exhibit enough curiosity to go as far as their windows to see what is happening. So anyway, that was it. It was a war zone. It did sound like a war zone. And it evoked this image of the West Bank. And so actually the approach of the Watts truce was to treat it like literally a negotiation between warring political factions. Oh, yes, warring political factions. And then there was also this Stanley Tukey Williams was a Crip who, while he was in jail for murder on death row, in prison on death row. He, he turned around his life. He was advocating peace. He had advocated for peace for many years, and he wrote this Tukey protocol for peace, right? And so there were also elements of that were used in the Watts Truce. Okay, but again, as I said before, the truce, it was successful in a way. It didn't totally hold, but it was remarkable. Okay, option 2 is a different approach. Treat the gang member, not the gang, treat the gang member and provide care and a pathway. So this is the approach that is espoused by a priest in LA, very prominent, well-known individual named Greg Boyle. They call him Father G. So Father G founded Homeboy Industries, and basically it's a rehab program, gang rehab, where he teaches them how to bake. How there's all sorts of Homeboy Industries now. I don't even know. Like, I think they have all kinds of things but basically I think the original one was baking. They would bake bread and they would, things like that, and they would sell it. And that was their rehab program. And I think now they have all different kinds of industries that they train the kids for, the guys for, guys and girls. They have both programs for women as well. And it's going strong. Started in the early 90s. I have a friend actually that works with Father G. I mean, just absolutely an amazing program, an amazing, amazing program. So here's a quote from Father G. He says, "At Homeboy Industries, we always say we don't work with gangs, we work with gang members. So if you work with a gang and it comes from a bad diagnosis, you end up thinking, well, this is the Middle East. Maybe this is Northern Ireland. Maybe the two sides sit down and try to resolve the conflict. Well, peacemaking requires conflict, and in gang violence, there is no conflict. There's violence for sure, but it's not about anything, right?" So he's calling it out. It's like these are sort of contrived fights that they're having with each other, right? We don't need to, we need to treat the gang member first. We need to give them the skills and the opportunities and the hope, right? That's how you pull them out of it, right? So those are the two options, right? Either you treat it like a political thing, or you treat the person, right? And then, option 3 is you treat both. And I drew this from, this is from Tukey's peace protocol, right? He says, failure to establish a truce that includes a social agenda will cause any negotiation for peace to relapse into war. I tend to think that the Watts Truce was successful enough that the political approach probably, I mean, I'm just imagining, again, based on dynamics of power, probably necessary to just calm things down. But as Tukey says, if you don't follow that up with a social plan, it's not going to hold, which it didn't, right? You need to have a comprehensive approach to stemming the violence. Okay, moving on, getting towards the end. Reproduction and reification of gang culture. So we talked about this in the video a little bit, right? But this commercialization of this, Black culture, right? Going around the world, being exported around the world. This is a cool clip. Again, if you click on it, it goes to the video, but it's a clip of Snoop talking about how the proliferation of gang culture. And basically, he talks about his album, which was called Make America Crip Again. And he was saying that he got a lot of heat for that. People were like, what do you mean? Like, you want it to be like ultra violent again? Like, what do you mean? And he's like, no. I want it to go back to the way it was in the 60s, when it was about community resistance and it was about protecting people in the community and not about anything else, not about drugs, not about guns. It was just literally taking care of each other. And so he says that's what he wishes all these people that have taken it up like that, he wishes that they knew that was what it really was about. But anyway, the point I want to make with the glorification is that this is a form of reproduction, right? That the fact that this, ultra violent, poor gang culture suddenly gets taken up by major music labels, it suddenly gets exported. This is a process of reproduction and reification. So again, reification is making something like abstract resistance into a thing, into something that can be commodified, right? that serves to take the power from it, and it takes it from being real resistance potentially. I don't know, not to say that the gang violence was about resistance, because I think by this point it wasn't, but it takes any potential resistance and it makes it into a commodity. It takes away all of its power in a that, might have existed in a counter hegemonic, context. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of the reification, right, is, I'm sorry I don't have time to like go through the Latino gangs, because the Latino gangs are also very interesting. They have a very different history. In LA, also became very violent. I think, around the 90s, at this time, I think they also adopted a lot of that Black culture, violence and aesthetic. But the physical deportation of gang members. So basically what happens is, you have these people coming as immigrants, maybe as young kids, whatever, very poor communities, getting involved with these Latino gangs. And you have them operating within this gang structure, culture, learning this violence, and then ultimately getting deported. And guess what happened? 1992, they started, really aggressively deporting Central Americans. And guess what got taken back to El Salvador, and Honduras and Guatemala, right? It's this very ultra violent gang culture. And so now you have these transnational gangs that are honestly terrifying, terrifying. Some of the kids, when I did volunteering, when I volunteered with the organization that worked with the unaccompanied minors, I didn't really work directly with the kids, but I worked with people who worked with the kids. And ultra violent, ultra violent. The people that would do their intakes would tell me, like, they would say, have you ever seen it, or how many dead bodies have you seen? And they'd be like, per day. I'm sorry to laugh, like, it's not funny, but it's like, it's so ultra violent. And it's a function of bad policy, bad US policy, again, taking away, those socialist leaders, like, over the last, 50 years or whatever. And then also exporting the gang violence, right? So you have these conditions of like poverty, extreme poverty, exploitation, corruption, right? And then on top of it, you add in this like super violent culture. And it's like, it's just, the US policy has basically destroyed Central America, from a social standpoint, right? And anyway, yeah, to my point about research, I mean, this was literally the only like academic article I could find. It was someone's thesis. So, it's very under-researched, this topic. And then just, there was a terrible story, this was from 2018, where this boy was he was acting as a informant to the FBI, basically secret informant ratting on his fellow, MS-13, gang members as a Salvadorian gang. And then he tried to claim asylum, but because he'd been so close with the FBI, he had told them that he had committed murders back in El Salvador. And and they said, well, you don't qualify for asylum because you committed a murder. And after he had literally risked his life being an informant. And so he felt super betrayed by the police, the FBI. And he basically, ProPublica, which is a, very important, journalistic outlet in the US, did this long form article on his whole experience. This link here, actually, so the article, if you click on this, we'll get to the article, but this here is a follow-up to the article, basically explaining, the ethical dilemmas that ProPublica dealt with, deciding whether or not to actually run this article, which, arguably risked the kid's life. In the end, he was deported, because he did not qualify for asylum on the basis that he had killed someone. But because of the article, he received so much support, and so many donations, he was able to go to a third country. And, that was not disclosed, obviously, but anyway, he I mean, he's a child. He's a child. He was an informant, you know, and they can't take care of him. I mean, it's just appalling. But anyway, this physical deportation it's another form of reproduction, reification that makes, you know, this gang culture, suddenly it's not the thing that it was in context. It's this other thing that is, you know, contributing to, you know, imperial interests or, you know, whatever in Central America. Okay, new paradigms from post-war global empire to neo-slavery. Why did my pictures not come out? It's so frustrating. Basically, okay, so this was an article I found. So anyway, going back to, I started with the post-World War II, just kind of touching base back there once more. The new economy that was created coming out of World War II was transnational. It was a transnational economy, a global economy, right? That's when it started, right? That's when this article says, right? Post-World War II, import substitution and export-led industrialization strategies are both part and parcel of the internationalization of capital, right? The state's task in this highly globalized capitalist era is more complex and contradictory than in the earlier stage. The state's role in the present period is to pursue national policies within an increasingly transnational environment. So it's, you know, very much concerned about other countries' policies to the extent that it affects our ability to make money, our, you know, corporations' ability to make money, right? That became a major concern of the US government. And so you had, you know, from the 50s, you know, continuing to the present, you know, you have active involvement of the US in the, you know, the domestic, you know, politics of other countries in a totally inappropriate way, you know, in a totally inappropriate way. But I would argue that this, you know, this transnationalization of capital is what gave rise to what's called empire. Empire is a concept. It was defined by Hart and Negri in 2000. Basically, it's like a global, this global connotation of hegemony, right? A global hegemony. It's different from imperialism. There's no territorial center of power, no fixed boundaries, ever expanding through networks of command. There's rule over the entire civilized world. It's not only a regime, but an order that suspends history. It portrays itself as outside of history, right? In the, you know, in the 90s, you had people talking about the end of history, right? Saying, oh, we've reached the like liberal order. There's no more history, right? You literally, like historians literally were making that argument in the 90s. And it manages not only territory, but populations, seeking to rule human nature, which touches on Foucault's concept of biopower. It feigns dedication to peace while it's bathed in blood, right? That's drawn from this original text, right? Hart and Negri. But anyway, this idea of global empire, global hegemony. You can see this happening, you know, like it, you know, going back to Iran-Contra, right? Going back to Iran-Contra, and then, you know, with the transnational gangs, it's like it's a global fight that we're fighting, right? Okay, evolving empire, right? Where are we today? I think, you know, arguably we're in a period of American neo-slavery. Sorry, I don't think I cited it, but that's not my term. Other people have used that term. I'll add it into my references. But anyways, yeah, like so the ACLU in 2022 did this report about they're calling it captive labor exploitation of incarcerated workers. So basically, when men are in prison, and maybe women too as well, when people are incarcerated, they actually work in the prisons. They work for-profit companies in the prisons. They make pennies per hour working for for-profit prisons. They also do in California, they also do wildfire service. And then once they get out, they actually can't work as firemen because they have a record. But anyways, but yeah, there's this total exploitation of incarcerated workers, people who are working as prisoners. Prison labor in the US is referred to as insourcing. Under the work opportunity tax credit, oh, they get subsidized for it as well. Employers receive a tax credit of $2,400 for every work release inmate they employ as a reward for hiring risky target groups. These workers are not only cheap labor, but they're considered easier to control. They also tend to be African American males. Oh, interesting. Companies are free to avoid providing benefits like health insurance or sick days. They also don't need to worry about union demands for vacation time, raises, or family issues. According to the Left Business Observer, the federal prison industry produces 100% of all military helmets, war supplies, and other equipment. The workers supply 98% of the entire market for equipment assembly services, 93% of paints and paintbrushes, 92% of stove assembly, 46% of body armor, 36% of home appliances, 30% of headphones, microphones, and speakers, and 21% of office furniture, airplane parts, medical supplies, much more. Prisoners are even raising seeing eye dogs for blind people. With all of that productivity, inmates make about 90 cents to $4 a day. Large companies that use slave prison labor: McDonald's, Starbucks, Walmart, Wendy's, Victoria's Secret, American Airlines, Avis Car Rental. These bottom two, I read that they use them for call centers. So this is where we are in the States. I actually don't know if Canada has a policy on hiring incarcerated workers or not. That'd be something I'd be curious about. Okay, resistance and reification. All right, resistance. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, when resistance becomes a commodity or something performative, resistors are being alienated and resistance is being reified. This stops it from being resistance, right? So when you take the Black culture and you export it and you make it something that's not what it originally was, it stops being about, that thing that it was, right? It becomes something else. When you see it in politics, right? Reification of Black resistance in politics. So this was from a few years ago, but you had a lot of protests about the inhumane treatment of Black people by police, right? And you have Justin Trudeau taking a knee. I mean, this is a very, I think, sinister strategy, right? To really defang like true movements of resistance. Because when you have Black protesters coming to the white politicians for the most part and saying, stop killing us, stop, treating us badly, stop oppressing us, whatever. If the politicians were to respond by saying, no, go away, we're not going to listen to you, or if they would just outright ignore them, that would only serve to make the resistance stronger, right? But when they say, no, you're right, we're going to do something symbolic to show that we think that you're right. And then they take a knee or they, do some performative thing. They put up a Black, thing on their social media profile or whatever it is. It's taking that act of resistance, possibly a genuine act of resistance and counter hegemony, and it's making it into like a thing that then becomes something not what it was, not what it doesn't have the power. It takes away the power that it originally had, right? So, okay, I said, when faced with glimmers of counter hegemony, agents of empire will reify the resistance movement, rendering it meaningless, right? And here's the American version. This was, I think in late 2020 after there was some civil unrest in summer of 2020. And they did this ridiculous stunt with, kneeling with the Kente cloth. I mean, again, this is totally performative, totally meaningless. All it does is serves to pacify the resistors and basically make their movement, render it basically meaningless. This, when you look at the example of the Watts truce, right? When the gang leaders who came together for the Watts truce, the police ridiculed them. The police were like, oh, this is just for show. This is not for real, like whatever. They got totally ridiculed by the police, because at the end of the day, the police have jobs because of the gangs, right? They get overtime because of the gangs. And so they don't really have an incentive to get rid of the gangs altogether, to have a peace treaty, to have a truce, right? So everything that they do beyond that, the gang units and whatnot, it's all performative, right? They don't really care about eradicating the gangs, right? And it's the same with this. None of these people kneeling, these politicians kneeling, really care about Black lives or whatever. This is like a political stunt. They're trying to gain, favor, to show that they're like progressive, but they don't really actually care about protecting Black lives. That's my take. Okay, my conclusion. So the rise of Black gangs in the US, it's rooted in a history of brutal violence, arguably genocide against Black men by the state. And it continues to this day in the form of neo-slavery, mass incarceration. The state used violence and sabotage to destroy real possibility for counter-hegemony by reifying Black culture into something that was criminal, right? Exportation of gang culture through media and also physical deportations dehumanize people of color on a global scale and exacerbate violence in countries that have already been victimized in other ways by the US empire, like the Golden Triangle countries of Central America. As encapsulated by the philosophies of Tukey and Father G, stemming gang violence requires negotiated peace and a social agenda to provide that care and the opportunity for those individual gang members. And then just, beware of sabotage, criminalization, commodification, which is like a form of alienation, as well as performative co-optation, which is reification of resistance movements. That's all I have. And if you've made it this far, thank you. Appreciate it. I hope I didn't put my email, but if you have any questions, you can email me. My email is kmath8080 at york.ca. Thanks very much.